Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Cucaruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. John and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Jim.
Welcome to another episode of Connecting with Conservation. I'm John Gassett, your co-host, and also from Wildlife Management Institute. I'm here with my fellow co-host, Jim Cucaruto.
All right. This is a new opportunity to have two Jims on the podcast at the same time. So, John, when you're asking a question, you're going to have to clarify. The smart Jim, and then Heffelfinger will answer, and then maybe the second smartest Jim on the podcast, and then I'll know it's my turn to speak. So let's go to the smart Jim. Tell us about yourself.
Everybody's smart about something, right? I'm Jim Heffelfinger. I'm a wildlife science coordinator for Arizona Game and Fish Department. Got 33 years with that state's wildlife agency to this point.
Awesome, Jim. Well, we've known each other for a while. I was an old deer biologist before, coming over to the dark side of the nonprofit world. But you are sort of an icon in the mule deer world, and I see your name everywhere. I know you've led the WAFWA Mule Deer Committee for I don't know how many years, but done really good things with mule deer. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with mule deer in the West and what some of the issues are.
Yeah, that's right. More than 20 years ago, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that we call WAFWA, established a mule deer working group. And that was in the early 90s when mule deer populations throughout the country were declining. And so the directors, they were getting chewed on by their constituents. And so they basically turned to the biologists and said, fix this, do something about it. And so they put this committee together. I was an Arizona representative. And after about 6 years, the chair retired and then recommended me, and I became the chair. So it's been almost 20 years that I've chaired that committee. And that committee WAFWA represents 24 Western states and Canadian provinces and territories. And so the Mule Deer Working Group Committee is one mule deer or black-tailed deer representative from each of those 24 Western states or provinces collectively. And so it represents a lot of smart people and all of the experts in Western North America that deal with mule deer and black-tailed deer. And we've met twice, or in the early years 3 times every year, and get together and we talk about mule deer issues, not jurisdiction by jurisdiction, state by state, but more ecoregion by ecoregion, west-wide, range-wide, what things are affecting mule deer populations and what can we collectively do about it. Maybe we can do research with 7 states collaborating together. Maybe there's some, and there is a lot of management issues that one state's dealing with, their constituents are really excited about, and yet it's something that other states and provinces have dealt with already. And so by working together, we can do a lot better in managing mule deer and just conserving them throughout the range rather than in our little silos.
Well, one of the things that I think really fascinating about mule deer that I didn't know, but as a result of some of the research, I guess, that y'all worked with University of Wyoming, is that unlike white-tailed deer, they do migrate. At least some of them do. And there was one, I think, a female mule deer that migrates a pretty good distance from across Wyoming, even into Idaho, I guess.
150 miles from southern, south central Wyoming up to the northwestern part of Wyoming, and then into a little patch of summer range in Utah, 150 miles. And they put a radio collar on her in southern Utah, followed her up there, and they were so anxious to see if she was going to come back or if that was just a bizarre movement, and the collar failed. And so it wasn't until the next year back on winter range in southern Wyoming that they were capturing deer again and captured her with her dead radio collar, put a new one on. Then they tracked her either the next year or the year after that, not only going those 150 miles back to Idaho, but another 90 miles farther to a new area. So once we started hanging GPS collars on deer and pronghorn and bighorn sheep and blood ungulates, we started learning some amazing things, just amazing things. We had no idea the kind of distances they were moving. And then now the science has has advanced to now they're looking at how much fidelity does an individual mule deer have from one year to the next? Are they following the same pathways? And mule deer are much more regimented in their migration pathways than, say, pronghorn. They're finding mule deer coming up like the next year on migration, coming up to the same juniper and again taking a left at that juniper. It's pretty amazing the things that they're learning.
Wow. And one of the, I think, interesting things about when you mention collars, and I've been on a number of in the East Coast here on a number of black bear den studies where they've got the collared sows, and I found it really interesting that piece of equipment was funded by excise tax dollars on firearms and ammunition. That's always something we always like to bring up, like the little things that you would never know that hunters and target shooters and gun owners pay for. Is that the same type of case out west with the mule deer and those equipment
absolutely.
You use?
More and more states are putting more and more collars on. The state of Utah maintains, not just a one-time deal, maintains 1,500 GPS collars on mule deer every year. And so that money comes from the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Wildlife Restoration Funds, but not only just to fund interesting research, but like in the case of the state of Utah, they have these collared animals in all these different management units that they manage. And so they're gathering information from the captures on what the fat levels look like in mule deer that year, survival rates. And then when fawns die and when adults die, what's killing those? Is it mountain lions? Is it malnutrition? And they, by game management unit, have this information on actual deer health and fat reserves, sources of mortality, what kind of predators are important. And then again, we're finding out some really neat things that's not all the same. You can have a whole bunch of game management units where nutrition is really what's holding that deer population back. And you can control all the predators you want. It doesn't matter. Nutrition's holding those populations back. And then they found a unit or two where the deer are in really good nutrition, have a lot of fat, and mountain lions are hammering them. And so when an agency has that kind of information, they can then say, okay, it doesn't make sense to us to kill predators in these units, but this unit here, we could relax that predation pressure by mountain lions and improve that deer population and help it come back. Those are really intelligent, informed decisions that managers are making because of that research, and that research is coming from that foundation of federal aid and wildlife restoration dollars that come through the state agencies.
I'm curious, does Arizona or the DNRs out west have any communication to hunters to, if they see, a mule deer's a collared deer, to avoid harvesting it, or does it not matter? Do they want some harvested, or?
Yeah, that all depends on the project. I had radio collared deer in Mississippi when I worked for Mississippi State University, and for that study, we put the word out: don't shoot our collared deer, because we were studying natural mortality. But a lot of projects, they want to know what % of the annual mortality of a buck is because of hunting, and so they want people to ignore the collar. If you would take that buck during a hunting season, go ahead and take that buck. And you would think that collars would be really obvious, but in reality, when you've got a radio collar on a wild animal, a lot of times they get harvested and people don't notice it till they walk up to it. They're surprisingly hard to see, actually. So it's not like it biases it a great deal. So they're it depends on the purpose of the research and whether you want to avoid those collars or just treat them as animals in the population.
And I think the default for a lot of hunters, at least the ones I've talked with in the past, if they do see it, the bias is typically against shooting it, and it's most likely because they think they're not allowed to. If they've not been told that otherwise, they don't want to do anything to jeopardize their ability to hunt or their license or whatever. So they tend to not shoot those animals, which does if you're trying to estimate hunting mortality and they're not shooting the ones with the collars on it, it's harder to you're not getting an accurate number.
Right. I know someone in South Texas who owns a lot of ranches, and he has at least 2 mounted deer that have the research ear tag still in them.
But one of the big the big issues talking about this movement of game species and everything, I know that y'all deal with out west, is connectivity. And a lot of hunters hear that word, don't really know what it means, but they use it all the time because the same hunter that hunts a bottleneck between 2 blocks of woods is using connectivity. The animals are moving from one block to another. It just happens to be a narrow pathway in between the two. And, so they don't think about it in that way, but it's really important out west when you got animals moving hundreds of miles. You got barriers like barbed wire fence and highways and, and other things that impede that. So we talk a little bit about connectivity and its importance in the West.
Yeah, a lot of those long migrations we talked about with mule deer and elk and other species, they're crossing jurisdictional boundaries from BLM to private to state, back to BLM to private. They're crossing some migrations 100 times across jurisdictions 100 times, and we're starting to learn from all of this data that people are starting to amass about all these big game animals moving across the landscape. Is you have to like stand back and start thinking of these large landscape scale conservation issues. The landscape itself almost looks like a living organism when you have these animals moving these great distances across that landscape, and it's forcing everybody to think bigger. It's not this little deer herd west of Cody, Wyoming, or whatever. It's this giant landscape with animals moving summer to winter all over the place, and it gets people thinking about highway crossings and start building in places where deer always seem to get smacked on the highway right here. Well, it's not random. It's because that's a bottleneck. They're moving through there. So there's things we can do about underpasses and overpasses to reduce deer mortality, more importantly, reduce human mortality on the highway, and to connect these habitats. And have that connectivity is important because you get snow up in the high country. Those animals can't feed with a foot of snow, so they bail off down into the lower country and eat sagebrush or what they have to, because it's relatively snow free, or they can get to the food. But also think about in the desert where animals aren't migrating because of snow. You get animals in the desert that have wide movements, not really seasonal migrations, but they need this connectivity of landscape because it may rain over here and they need to go over there and get water and get green and get nutrition until it rains again over where they were and move back and forth. So animals can move great distances, not only because of snow and the traditional migrations, but because of rainfall distribution, because of disturbance. You could have something coming into an area and disturbing it, a development, and those animals need to move. And if they're all hemmed in by fences, they just can't move, and you get higher mortality and just lower reproduction because they're not getting the nutrition they need. They're exposed to more mortality sources, getting caught in fences, getting smacked on the highway.
So I know you mentioned, mule deer, and that's a big one out west for you guys. I'm an East Coast guy, so it's all whitetail for me. But, I'm no biologist, but I think there's at least 4 types of deer, right? You got whitetail, you mentioned blacktail, mule deer, and then, the fun one that I don't know how to pronounce it, the koozie deer, the coos deer, the cows deer. Am I missing any others? Like, I always like to say koozie because I tend to have one
That's
in my
right.
hand when I'm...
Yeah.
But
there's about 38 subspecies of whitetail. Most of those are not valid. There's a couple that seem to be valid. There's a key deer in southern Florida in the Florida Keys that are much smaller. They're isolated geographically, ecologically, they're real different. The Cow's white-tailed deer, which is how you pronounce it, Cow's white-tailed deer in Mexico and the Southwest, that genetically is different. It's physically different. Its distribution is separate from other whitetail everywhere, except when you go into Mexico, it blends into these smaller Mexican whitetails that nobody knows how many subspecies, or maybe they're all Cow's whitetail, all the way down to southern Mexico. We don't really know. The rest of North America for whitetail, really, there's no genetic differences that people have found. There's like 28 subspecies in North America. And there's really, when you read the differences between them, they're just this one's darker, this one's lighter, this one's bigger, this one's smaller. There's not really anything that science would support other than their Cow's whitetail that we know about and our key deer. When it comes to mule deer, the mule deer book that we just published with it's a ecology and management of blacktail and mule deer in North America, and it's got a chapter 1 on taxonomy that looks at subspecies and takes all the genetic information and all the physical information that's available and revises the subspecies of mule deer from 11 down to just 5. And there's a Sitka blacktail in the Pacific Northwest and Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. South of that, there's a Columbian blacktail along the coast that goes down into Northern California. And then there's 2 island Mexican mule deer populations, one on Tiburon Island and one on Cedros Island. Those have been isolated for like 10,000 years. They're probably good. They've got some physical differences, some genetic differences. They're probably good subspecies. And then the rest of North America, other than the 2 blacktails and the 2 island Mexican populations, everything else is just mule deer. There's no good reason to separate mule deer in North America, on continental North America, from Mexico all the way up to, there's even some in the Yukon territory. So it depends how much you want to slice and dice it. There's 5 different types of mule deer that I and my co-author in that chapter 1 of that mule deer book identified, who's a geneticist, Emily Latch at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I've worked with genetic stuff for 30 years, almost 20 years probably, with her. And then with whitetail, those 2 key deer and cow's deer, and then most of the other whitetails are pretty much the same.
So I have to ask you now, because having been my former passion and training with whitetails, I agree with that almost 100%. I mean, like, for example, Georgia, where I grew up, there's 6 or 7 barrier islands, and every barrier island has its own subspecies of white-tailed deer, except you can throw a rock from island to island. The deer certainly swim the inlets, and they move freely back and forth. But the one place where I might take a little exception is, it seems to me that the Borealis subspecies and the Virginia subspecies, and I'm living in a state that, north of the Ohio River, the deer are distinctly, number one, they're 40 to 50 pounds heavier, the bucks are when they're mature, and they have larger, heavier beams, oftentimes, double drop times, match drop times, come across the river into Kentucky, except in one county, and they look more like a southeastern deer. They're thin racks, 200 pounds versus 270 pounds. And that one county I mentioned is on the border there. And, having spent a lot of time with those deer, I think what happened is if they are a true, genetically distinct, it's a spillover from Ohio, from Adams County. That deer moved across at some point and they sort of took root. But that county in Kentucky, you kill deer that look like Ohio deer or Michigan deer or Canadian deer. Every other county in Kentucky, they're different animals. I mean, they look different. Now, phenotypically, they may look different, still don't make them genetically different. But certainly, I can see how somebody could look at one and say, that one's, that one could eat the one I shot last year in Kentucky.
Yeah, those deer in Wisconsin where I grew up, and Borealis up north in Canada, they're nothing like the deer in the southeastern United States. But the body size and the genetic information that is available, just that there's this body size climb from big to small. And I haven't seen the division you're talking about. I didn't live in Kentucky, although my son does. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that division. So I'd like to see some genetic work.
Yeah, I would too. I've always been fascinated by that little inholding of the Ohio looking deer in Kentucky. It's like, I know they're different. They look different. I just don't know why they're there. The Ohio River is a significant barrier. At that point, it's still over a mile wide. So
yeah, I think I should come down and sample some, and we'll take a look.
You've got an open invitation for that, so that's not a problem. Well, you obviously work on things other than deer, and I know you and I have worked sort of on a parallel course when we were doing a review of the Fish and Wildlife Service's red wolf restoration in eastern North Carolina, and you spent a good part of your career working on Mexican wolf restoration in the Southwest. And we actually, with those 2 projects, we found that, originally the eastern wolf, the red wolf, butted up against the Mexican wolf somewhere in Texas. And I think maybe we were the first people that ever really, definitively pointed that out. But
I have worked the last 15 years. I've been at the forefront of our agency's Mexican wolf restoration. Was on the last Fish and Wildlife Service recovery team that we had, and that was disbanded. I was on there for 2 years, disagreed with what everybody else on the recovery team was doing and the direction, the trajectory of what they wanted to see for recovery, which didn't make any sense to me. And I resigned and wrote a big report on what I thought were process flaws and flaws in the science that they were trying to use. And the Fish and Wildlife Service halted recovery at that time. In a couple of years, came back with a more sensible way to write a recovery plan, and that was not with a small handful of academics who have some very strong views that kind of conflict with some of the science that I was familiar with, but they pulled together state wildlife agencies, New Mexico, Arizona, even Utah, Colorado, and pulled together with other academics too that were a little less biased and had some good information to bring to the table, and Fish and Wildlife Service people. And we worked together in a really, truly good federal state collaboration to put together a recovery plan for a species that was going to affect everybody. And the recovery plan we published in 2017 was a good, solid recovery plan that would get the Mexican wolf away from extinction so it's no longer in danger of extinction, but to do it in a practical way that could be tolerated by people who live and work and recreate on the landscape. So I'm really proud of that recovery plan. It's been the subject of lawsuits. There's some protectionist groups that want any kind of wolves anywhere, and they want as many of them as possible. And that's just not reasonable. When you're the agency that's responsible for recovering an endangered species, you have to do it in a way so that they're no longer in danger of extinction, but in a way that people on the landscape can tolerate them. We're not living in a little academic bubble and deciding what's best for the wolves. And we did that. So I'm pretty proud of that. And since then, I've been involved in all of our Mexican wolf dealing as kind of providing the scientific foundation, scientific basis, written some scientific papers to support the recovery plan since then.
Yeah, they're an interesting creature. I tell you, the fact that with the red wolves anyway, they pulled them all out of the wild in the 70s and spent all this time and money trying to get them restored on the coastal North Carolina, and we came in and basically said, look, this is not a viable project here. It's going to, they're being swamped by coyotes, and they're getting killed at unreasonable rates or unsustainable rates. But then, 3 years ago, they find scat in coastal South Carolina that's 95% red wolf DNA, and they've been gone from there for 40, 50 years, they thought, but apparently they didn't. So,
I did some good work about some of the alleles that are like red wolf alleles that are still in those canids down there. You can't really call them coyotes. I'm not sure what they're canids. The Mexican wolf distribution, it's interesting. Even West Texas, the early wolves that were killed around the late 1800s, early 1900s, mostly early 1900s, were larger wolves like plains wolves from the north. They weren't the smaller Mexican wolves in West Texas. Once they were wiped out, like wolves were most places on the continent, then about 20 or 30 years later, a couple wolves showed up and were trapped, and they were consistent with Mexican wolves. So it's felt that even West Texas was a southern plains wolf that they call Canis lupus nubilis. And when that was wiped out, Mexican wolves from the Sierra Madre just crossed and came up and filled that gap. In fact, of the 3 Mexican wolves documented in West Texas, 2 of them they thought were siblings from 2 males from the same litter. They were both young males, both the same year after a couple of decades of no wolves being in the country. Now these 2 young wolves, 1 year old, get caught in traps like 60 miles apart. So West Texas really was not the heart of Mexican wolf country, but red wolves came back almost to West Texas.
And so what's the population now of the wolves there, that you're working on? And again, you collar them, you use PR dollars to do all this research and learn about.
Absolutely. Since Mexican wolves, and it's good we're making that distinction because Mexican wolves and red wolves are both kind of small, southern, endangered wolves. So people get them confused all the time. But red wolves are a different kind of critter. They're not gray wolves. Whereas Mexican wolves are just a smaller southwestern subspecies of the gray wolf, the same thing we have in Yellowstone, but a small version that evolved in the Sierra Madre of Mexico. 90% of their historic range was in Mexico. And so our agency is working with Fish and Wildlife Service. It's important to say the Fish and Wildlife Service is a lead agency since it's an endangered species. But part of the Endangered Species Act, Section 6 of the Endangered Species Act, says that the Fish and Wildlife Service will work with the state agencies to recover endangered species, and we get Section 6 money from the Fish and Wildlife Service. That money we could use for any of the endangered species or a lot of different things. We choose to use that money for Mexican wolves because we're committed to recover Mexican wolves in the Southwest with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we work closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We also have a good friendship with friends and colleagues in Mexico that have been interested and been working on Mexican wolves in Mexico. So I'll go to Mexico once or twice a year and work with friends that are down there helping recover a population of Mexican wolves or 2 populations in Mexico along with the population that straddles the Arizona-New Mexico border. And that money, some of the money that we spend is a lot of it's Fish and Wildlife Service money that comes through Section 6. There's some other grants that come in and go to the Arizona Game and Fish Department, New Mexico Game and Fish Department, some NGOs and other entities that all work together on that. We've got an interagency field team, which has Fish and Wildlife Service, Arizona Game and Fish, New Mexico Game and Fish, Wildlife Services, all working together as one team, an interagency team working in the field on Mexican wolves, which I don't get to do that fun stuff. I'm stuck doing more recovery planning and the science part of it. So you don't see me carrying a wolf over my shoulder, cutting out of a helicopter and all that cool stuff. But it's a good system where everybody's working together to recover wolves. And some of that, Arizona Game and Fish has spent more than $10 million since 1982 on recovering Mexican wolves. We have 5 full-time paid positions that are devoted to working on Mexican wolf recovery. And that's the state agency that's working to do that. In my position, I spend a lot of time on Mexican wolves, and I'm not even one of the 5 that's included in that. So our commission has always been committed to recovering Mexican wolves. And sometimes in the hunting community, you have some hunters that don't really like the idea of recovering animals that are going to be competitors for our number of deer tags and elk tags. But I always say we've got 95% of the public of the United States that doesn't hunt. And so our ability to keep on hunting relies entirely on that 95% of the people seeing hunting and hunters as a positive force for conservation. And once they start seeing us not as a positive force for the restoration of native species and conservation, that's where we get in a bind. The populations of wolves recovered on the landscape and killing more elk than when we didn't have any wolves. That's not going to stop hunting. But having 95% of the public saying, we really like wolves, and you guys are just, shoot, shovel, and shut up and smoke a pack a day and all that stuff. You don't sound like the conservationists, the hunter conservationists that you always claim to be. You want to thump your chest that you recovered elk and pronghorn and geese and white-tailed deer, but you don't want to cover the other native species. And once we get on the wrong side of the table from the 95% that doesn't hunt, that's what's going to jeopardize the future of hunting. And I went on a cow elk hunt this December with my 91-year-old dad and 2 sons in northern Arizona. It was fantastic. It was a magical time together with 3 generations of Heffelfingers in the woods. We didn't get an elk, but we had such a great time staying in an Airbnb, joking around. My sons get to hear stories that my dad's telling about pranks they pulled in high school. That kind of fun comes from the elk tags that we apply for and don't get, but apply for every year. And so I'd be the first one to not want to see cow elk tags being reduced because now we don't need to kill as many cows because wolves are taking some of the elk population. I mean, I don't want to see a less opportunity to go cow elk hunting with my family, but you have to look at the bigger picture that the future of hunting relies on us being on board for recovering all native species, not just the ones that we want to eat, but also the other animals that eat those same species.
Well, that's I think is an interesting. I always thought projects like that where you're trying to recover a sensitive or imperiled species seem to always are more successful if there's a game biologist in the mix. And the reason I say that is because they don't have that mentality of we have to save every last one. They're used to regulated loss, annual loss due to whatever type of mortality, so that they don't get emotional about it. And they probably have been exposed more to the hunting public side of things and the pressures that come from there. So they tend to, and they know the impacts, they're sensitive to the impacts those endangered wolves have on game populations. So you sort of get a good rounded balance versus, the folks that put a wall up around themselves and say we want every last wolf to survive and we don't care how many elk they eat. That doesn't fly either.
And that's what we had when I was early on the recovery team. I said, well, we have to do this kind of in a measured, responsible way. We don't want the wolves killing half of the elk population. And the others said, why not? We've got too many elk. Why would we not want wolves killing half the elk? So that's the kind of mentality I was dealing with from the very start. But they put me on the recovery team because of my experience and knowledge in ungulates. And in the past, they never had that. They had some geneticists and they had some really advocacy-oriented protectionist professors that were driving and trying to implement their own little recovery plan. And then they threw Heffelfinger literally to the wolves and put me on the recovery team, which turned out to be great because I added that balance and started asking some important questions. And sometimes there wasn't answers. They were just running off in what a lot of us thought was the wrong direction. But having me on there with some experience with the hunting community was really important in providing that balance and making sure bad things didn't happen.
Yeah, and these conversations are exactly why, John and I were like, we've got to have these conversations with all the unsung heroes like you. And we had Chuck Sykes on from Alabama DNR talking about saving a salamander. So it's not just, about game species for hunters. It's the birds, the bees, the pollinators, the bats. I mean, again, all funded by people that like to hunt, fish, trap, and shoot for primarily. But it's important to tell these stories, and there has to be a balance. We know that just nature doesn't take care of itself when you have 320 plus million people in America now and growing and taking away habitat. So we really appreciate all the work that the DNRs are doing and that you're doing here. And I'm really proud of myself for picking out the smart Jim right off the bat, because man, after the last half hour here, I proved my point.
In our agency, we have a lot of gyms, and I've been in a conference room before with 5 gyms. And so in Arizona Game and Fish, we all developed nicknames. I was Jackrabbit Jim. Our attorney, assistant attorney general, well, our attorney now was Legal Jim. Then there was Biker Jim, and there was Cowboy Jim, and there was Vertical Jim, a really tall Jim. He was Vertical Jim. So we had a lot of gyms, and those nicknames were important, because when you're in the conference room, the director says Jim, and we all looked like he's talking about me. So that was important. But I'm glad you started talking about these other species, because 2 years ago in Louisville at the National Wildlife Society meeting, which is a collection of all wildlife professionals, I organized a half-day symposium of 8 talks, 4 in the first session, 4 in the second session, and it was called State Wildlife Agency Conservation: More Than Bucks, Bullets, and Bulls, I guess. But we had someone talk about the state of Washington's state-led wolf recovery. It wasn't Fish and Wildlife Service. They weren't endangered. It was the state of Washington leading wolf recovery. They had someone talk about pollinator conservation throughout the West, through WAFWA. Had someone talk about Arizona Game and Fish Department's 30 years of having a non-game wildlife branch. We're just non-game work with some lottery money that we got. But it's not only the lottery money paying for non-game, but the federal aid and wildlife restoration money provides this agency infrastructure that you can then just like add some money to from some other source, and you've got this infrastructure to implement that money. Where a standalone, without the $100 standalone, you couldn't just implement that and do that non-game work. We had other people talk about like Utah's habitat. They've got a huge habitat program where they're just improving thousands of square miles of habitat. But the Arizona Game and Fish talk was talk about all of our efforts in collaborating with the Fish and Wildlife Service with recovering black-footed ferrets and jaguars, Mexican wolves, condors, Sonoran pronghorn, endangered masked bobwhite. We've always been very, very involved in the recovery of endangered species. We've got committees. Actually, we've got a black-footed ferret committee that I also serve on. We've got Sonoran pronghorn committee that I chaired for a while. We've got two other committees that are endangered species specific committees, and also it'd be good for you to do a whole podcast on somebody that knows about state wildlife action plans, and talk about the funding came through 20 years ago to fund a program, and all agencies had to develop a state wildlife action plan, and that state wildlife action plan involved listing the species of special concern that you had in your state. And through that species of special concern, and there's 12,000 species of special concern nationwide that state agencies have identified and have an action plan on how they're going to conserve those species and the habitat they depend on. I mean, that's an incredible story, because that's state wildlife agencies that are driving conservation of all the native species. We're not just about going out and checking hunting licenses and making sure we do deer and elk surveys. We're about conserving all the native species for all the people in the state, whether they hunt or fish or just viewing. You know, everybody that goes camping and they see elk while they're camping, everybody loves that. You don't have to be an elk hunter. I mean, that's just fun. And so we have to have robust, healthy populations of elk. And it's the consumptive part of the user groups that are assuring that those populations are healthy.
So where can folks go to learn more about specifically what's happening in Arizona, whether they want to hunt or just learn about conservation?
Yeah. Arizona, the website azgfd.gov. And we revamped our website a little while ago, and it's got a lot of great information on there.
Awesome. Well, Jim Heffelfinger, Jim, it's been great. We knew you'd be a great guest. We just had to catch you at the right moment, and we appreciate you spending some time with us. Jim Cucurito, my co-host, always good to see you again. We appreciate what both of you do for conservation. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, listen to our other episodes and subscribe to our podcast. You'll get notifications when we drop new ones every week. So other than that, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the woods or on the water.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.